I remember exactly when I learned how important faith is to recovery. It was in the summer of 1983, and I was watching a Barbara Walters interview with an actor I really liked, Daniel J. Travanti. He was on a popular series I enjoyed called Hill Street Blues. And in that interview, Barbara Walters asked Daniel J. Travanti about his alcoholism. And he shared some about this and about his journey with Alcoholics Anonymous, and in particular mentioned the 12 steps. And she said, well, what are the 12 steps? And he right away just rattled through all 12 of the AA steps. I did not know until that moment, and when I heard them, how faith-based they are. They're on the screen now, or if you can't see them well, they're also printed on the back of the bulletin and will be throughout this series. Literally half of the 12 steps talk about God. Very faith-based, and even the ones that don't have a very spiritual component to them. And that's filtered on into the Narcotics Anonymous and Overeaters Anonymous and into the recovery movement, how important faith is to recovery. I'm so glad this morning that we are starting this worship series, and I'm very grateful to the folks who are part of our beginning of 2017 series on stress. At the end of that series, we were talking about what we should do this year, and I was actually honestly thinking resiliency. And some folks on that team said, no, we really need to talk about addiction. And all throughout this year, that has struck me again and again that this was the right choice. As we've heard about the opioid crisis and how that is getting worse and worse in our nation, I thought it's good we're talking about this. As I've had personal encounters and conversations with people, things that went on my list of encounters, I realized just how important it is that we talk about addiction and recovery. I thought about this as I read the surveys that people filled out for this worship series. As I read through them, and there was one question that hit me in particular: how frequently has addiction affected you or someone you know? And almost half of the surveys, people wrote constantly, every day, my entire life, all my childhood, or they live with a family member who has an addiction. I thought about how good it is we're doing this series. As I read different books in preparation, and particularly the one that we chose, the Recovery-Minded Church. And as I read that, I thought, this is a good topic, a great topic, an important topic to be talking about in church. While I'm mentioning the book, by the way, I did highlight how we'll be using the book throughout the series. There's an insert that describes that. You know how when you read a book, and you always kind of, at least when I read, I think, well, I would have done a couple things a little bit different. Just two things as you read the book. One is he seems to focus, I think, a little too often that it's written for pastors or church leaders. Just ignore that, because I think everything you read will be a blessing no matter where you are in the life of the church. And the other thing that I would have done just a little bit differently is the chapter on interventions. I think I would have moved it more toward the end, or maybe even to an appendix, because it's a challenging experience, best supported by someone that's been trained or has experience with it. I just would have moved it a little later in the book. But other than that, I think the book is going to be a great blessing. And one thing I really appreciated about the book is it reminded me of the key story in the Bible about addiction. And I want to spend some time with that story this morning. It's found in the Gospel of Luke in the 15th chapter. Luke, one of the 4 accounts of Jesus' life. And oftentimes this story is given a name. The parable of the prodigal son, a parable, a teaching story as Jesus did. I think we almost do a disservice by naming the parable. Jesus didn't give it a name. By giving it a name, it only describes one thing. And the great thing about this teaching story is it communicates on multiple levels. When you get how fully powerful this story is, you could give it half a dozen different names. So we're going to look at this story. It's in chapter 15. It starts in verses 1 through 3. Now, all the tax collectors and sinners, these are the outsiders, the broken in Jesus' society. They were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes, these are the religious leaders of Jesus' day. They're the upright. They're the ones that supposedly, are the good people in his society. They're grumbling and saying, this fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. They think that Jesus should only be spending time with the good people, not these broken outsiders. So Jesus told them this parable. Well, in fact, he told 3 parables. We've skipped the first 2. I would commend them to your reading. One is about a lost sheep, and another is about a lost coin. But then we're going to jump to verse 11, where he tells a 3rd story about a lost son. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." Understand what this boy is saying to his dad. He's saying, Dad, let's pretend you've died and I get the property I would get when you die. Will you give that to me? This is what he says to his father. We don't know why he says this, but as the story unfolds, we can take some guesses. So he did it. So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. The Bible does not describe addiction by that name, but it's certainly possible that this is a description of this boy, this young man. And even if we wouldn't necessarily call it addiction, clearly this young man has some problems that he would choose to do this. When he had spent everything, in short order he blew all that his father had given him. A severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. Remember that Jesus is speaking to predominantly Jewish people at this point, and in the Jewish faith, the pig is the most disgusting, the most unclean of all the animals, and this kid has the job of caring for the pigs. And he would have gladly filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. The slop that the unclean pigs are eating looks good to this boy. But then the scriptures say, Jesus says in his stories, but when he came to himself, this is such a huge statement. When he came to himself, when he came to the person that he was supposed to be. As I've interacted with folks with addictions through the years, again and again, I've reminded people that they're not the person that they're supposed to be. They're not who they are in God's eyes. They're far away from that. And this boy finally realizes, I am not the person that I'm supposed to be. I've sat with wives and children and parents who've said to their loved one, I want the person back that I used to know before the addiction. And that's what this boy comes to. He comes back to himself. And he says, how many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and I will go to my father and I will say to him, and he works out his little speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. And then he set off and he went to his father, which is such a huge moment that he realizes that he needs help in the life of someone who has an addiction. there is that time when they realize that they need help. And one of the things I admire about folks who are in recovery is their sense of a dependence on God. I think many times for a lot of us, we think, oh, I'm just doing kind of fine. God's just kind of the side a little bit. But when you have an addiction, as the 12 steps remind us, there's a place where you say, I need God's help. It's the only way that I can handle the challenges, the disease that I have. And that's what that young man says. I'm going to go. I'm going to go to him. And while he was still far off, his father saw him, was filled with compassion, and he ran and he put his arms around him. Notice the father doesn't chase after the boy and search for him, because you can't make someone who has an addiction change. But when the boy is ready to come home, he got his eyes ready, and he's looking for him. He doesn't stand on the porch and go, oh, look who's home. He runs down the road. And if you take this story as an analogy for God, God, the creator of the universe, runs down the road to welcome the one who is lost, throws his arms around us and kisses us. And then the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And that's as far as he gets in his little speech. But the father says to his slaves, quickly, come, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Remember, this is likely stuff the boy left with before and then squandered. But the father doesn't care. He gives him all brand new stuff again. Get the fatted calf and kill him. Let us eat and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He is lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Recovery is about a transformation. And that transformation the father sees. He was dead and now he's alive. He is lost and now he's found. And he's back in the place where he belongs, where he fits. He's back in the community. And one of the things that I admire as well about those who know recovery is they know a sense of community that sometimes we don't know in other places or even in churches. As they gather in groups, as they have a sponsor, somebody who's been on the journey but further along supports them. They have a strength and a support that they need. And I think many of us need to learn about. You know, it's that sense of celebration of being home that caused me to put up the decorations in here this morning. Maybe some of you realize that already. This is the welcome home for all of us with God, and especially those in recovery. And I'm going to leave them up throughout this series as a reminder of our welcome home from God. But that's not the end of the story. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he got him home safe and sound. And then he became angry and refused to go in. Remember again that Jesus is telling this story to the establishment who thinks that there are the good people and the bad people. And oftentimes, even in our life in the church, we kind of, well, the church is for the good people and the broken people are outside. And we're often too like the older son. But his father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, and we can hear his resentment in him. Listen, for all these years, I've been working like a slave for you, and I've never disobeyed your command. Yet you've never even given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. When this son of yours, notice that, by the way, not my brother, but your son comes home, you devour your property with prostitutes, and you kill the fatted calf for him. He's so judgmental of his brother. He doesn't realize that given the right circumstances it could just as easily be him who's in just as broken a situation. And that, again, is common in the church. We don't realize that given the right circumstances, it can be us that's suffering with an addiction, that has these challenges in our lives, in our families. I remember talking to a lady named Chris many years ago, and she had an addiction, alcohol and some drugs. It had caused great pain in her life, some infidelity when she'd been with other guys while drunk. And then she got into AA. And it was so hurtful for her the day that she was going to the AA meeting at her church. And some ladies saw her going in and made a snide comment. And she said what hurt the most is that they didn't know about the things that were happening before that. And it was actually as she was getting healthy and going to AA that then the snide comments came. It's so like the brother, and sometimes true in our churches. But the father tried to explain to him. Then he said to him, "Son, you were always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But don't you see? We had to celebrate and rejoice." And he says it again. This brother of yours, not this son of mine, this brother of yours was dead, and he's come to life. He's lost, and he's been found. He reminds us again of the transformation that can take place in recovery. He reminds him that he's welcome home. And again, if we take this as an image of God, it's a reminder for us of the great love that God has for us. I hope you'll hold on to this story as we continue on in this series, to remember that we are part of the story. It reminds us that we're the father sometimes, we're the older brother, we're the younger brother sometimes. And it especially reminds us that that father is our Father who loves us and has grace for us.